Now we're going to look at responding to the reading and how our students can write to show their analysis and understanding and all the comprehension that goes on during the reading process. So I've kind of set up a scenario for us. So it looks a little something like this. Joaquin has dropped his phone in a toilet. It does not operate. It is done. He's broken, but he's got a plan. So his big plan is he's going to go to his mom. He's going to discuss the tragedy. He's going to kind of lay it all out that he understands his performance has to be better, and he'll avoid water and all that. But when he sits down with his mom, guys, she has a different plan. She gives him 4 choices and tells him he's got to pick the best choice. And they are these. A, Mom, I'm sorry, I'm completely inept. B, Mom, this is really all your fault for trusting me. C, Mom, I understand you will never buy me a phone again. Or D, Mom, please help me learn from my mistakes. Okay, so we've got these 4 responses, and that's how she's going to handle it. All right. How do you feel about this, folks?
I feel like I'm somewhere between the smirk and the frown, the dark orange and the red. I mean, she's given him choices, that's true, and she's narrowed it for him. But my mom kind of sometimes did things like this where she would give me a choice and kind of would imply like if I didn't make the right choice, like there would be consequences, but not to the level of multiple choice.
Right. I think I'm right there with you in the orange face. There's choices, but what are they really taking away from this? So.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say is that maybe multiple choice in this setting requiring explanation is not the best way to go about things?
I mean, maybe not. I mean, you could do it, but
yeah, because I mean, if we think about it, the outcomes of this whole approach here is Joaquin really doesn't have to decide how he feels at all. I mean, he was prepared to explain it, but he doesn't have to because all he's got to do is pick an option. And then to extend that, he doesn't even necessarily have to pick the one he believes in. He just has to guess what he thinks she wants to hear. And then lastly, I mean, if he's between options, there's no way to clarify or split the difference. He's got to commit to one. And so there's no way for him to clarify his own reasoning here. And while these options are faster, you know, does his mom really get at all what Joaquin is thinking?
Well, you know, that second bullet point's interesting because how many of our students write what they think we're looking for? And it's not actually genuine at all.
Or guess, right? On the multiple choice. I mean, if we haven't picked up by now, this is a metaphor. Like this isn't
that's smart.
Really a thing. It's more a way for me to slide in here that while we do a lot with multiple choice, maybe it doesn't let us really see what our kids know. And it doesn't give us time to adjust. You know what I'm saying?
How could the state be wrong, though?
I didn't say anything about anybody being wrong. I just said maybe that's not our most productive. So let's think about outcomes we want to see. So ideally here, transitioning to students and out of the metaphor, ideally we want students to think for themselves to respond. Okay, that's, I think, key, step 1. We want them to have an opportunity to clarify or justify their thinking, because how many times have we had a student answer and then we walk away thinking, what? So we want them to have time and the opportunity to double back and make it make sense. And then I think that idea of flexibility when responding. Multiple choice, I'm locked into this one idea. And sometimes in a written response, there's that ability to have multiple responses that both show the same understanding, right? Like if we're doing character analysis, there are multiple characters and I could show that I get the concept. by picking any of the characters in the text. So those, I think, would be ideal outcomes, something we would want to see. So how do we take those outcomes and put them into the work we're doing with the text? So let's think about the steps of this connection. So the beginning of it has to start with reading and examining a text closely. Do we agree, folks, that some of the marquee things we're looking at are theme or message, structure, and then the tools or devices used to create meaning? Is there anything else you want to add to that list?
I think that pretty much nails it. I mean, tools or devices kind of catches all the other things.
That's
Yeah.
what I was going for. Yeah, no, we could break down tools and devices, we could break down structure, but I think ultimately those are the things we're looking for, and we need the kids to really examine those based on the instruction they've received. And then instead of doubling down on multiple choice, we want to offer writing as a way to describe what they've learned from the text and explain how they arrived at that understanding. So when we're reading, and going back to just this understanding piece, before we can write, we got to analyze the text. Some options that you are probably very familiar with are close reading phases, notice and note, annotation. And in fact, I would go so far to say these are all similar and possibly in some ways the same. But the idea is, to accomplish this, we don't need to find any groundbreaking new strategy. It's about taking the tools we have and really helping kids see, how do we analyze this text? Close reading is something that a lot of campuses have started going back and revisiting as it's been rolled out to administrators this year. There was a note by Kylan Beers and Bob Probst is actually embedded in our HMH resources. And annotation is the tale as old as time, right? Like, just mark what you see in the text as you're reading. These are not mutually exclusive. They can happen in tandem, but do we agree that they should be modeled?
Yes, I mean, if you tell kids to annotate, you need to show them how you want them to annotate. And yes, close reading and notice and note really are annotation strategies, but they take very different approaches. So you need to show it to them. I mean, you could pull talk, read, talk, write, pay attention to list and put it on this bulleted list as well. That's a style of annotation. So I think, but it has to be modeled. They have to know, okay, if I'm looking for this, if I'm looking for figurative language, how does that prove the author's purpose? So how do I mark the figurative language and then talk about what it does in the margins when I annotate it?
Well, yeah, and students fall into the trap, especially when it's not modeled, of, okay, annotation is just me highlighting or circling or underlining important things that are important to me, but I don't actually explain why I did any of that. And so that's where the modeling really comes in, and it shows them that there is a thought process behind the annotation itself.
You know, that's a really good point. I'm sure you've done it too, but I know early in my teaching career making the mistake of taking annotations for a grade, and then I just get back the yellow piece of paper because they highlighted everything, and I'm like, oh, see, covered. But really, I didn't explain what I wanted. I just told them you need to mark it up. So absolutely.
Well, that and it falls into, you say, okay, highlight all the important things. This whole page is highlighted. Well, it's all important. I don't know any of it.
It's all critical.
Right. Well, okay.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good segue to thinking about, so what do we need to make sure we do when we're trying to help our kids analyze texts? So starters, and again, these may be review for you, but they're just things we want to keep fresh to help set up those writing responses that we're going to get to here in a bit. So first, focusing on one, maybe two, but I think it's good to stick with one TEKS-based skill. When we try to do all of the things, that's where our kids get lost. So really keying in on one thing at a time. Modeling and thinking aloud, we just talked about it, but showing students the positive habits, showing them what we expect is critical. Asking questions along the way. Sometimes just modeling doesn't quite get them over the hump. So can we ask questions to prod them along once we start turning the work back over to them? And lastly, we talked about annotation a second ago, but just being very specific with what we're asking them to annotate. And that ties in with the first bullet really closely, I think. Okay, if this is our skill, this is what I want you to mark. Chris, you even talked about it with figurative language earlier. If figurative language is the thing, I want you to just annotate figurative language examples. And we're going to circle back to those and make sure we really understand how that's used in the text.
Right. And if you look at I think the standard is something about authors' use of language.
Yes.
So that can even, like when we focus on one, maybe two TEKS-based skills, maybe like even one standard, we have 2 or 3 different passes that we do just focusing on figurative language. The next one on diction, the next one on the other pieces that might include. So it's okay to say targets, not just the standard.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of our standards are so packed, you've got to break them down. All right, so let's kind of make this practical for a second. I'm going to be modeling kind of what we're talking about with close reading, but you could do this with notice and note. You could do this with just asking them to annotate. You could do this with any number of strategies. I'm sticking with kind of close reading here. And the passage we'll be looking at is from Avid Weekly. You'll see it through this entire session. The title is kind of lengthy, but hand dryers are clearly dangerous to children's hearing. Published research by a 13-year-old says. This is originally a Washington Post piece by Christopher Ingram. And you'll notice for what I'm doing with close reading, I've got it set up in 2 columns. Regardless of the strategy you're using, I like the 2-column approach. It gives the kids a clear place to mark up or take their notes as you work through it. But we've got the text on the left, and then on the right, there is a column with the standard at the top. So we're going to be working, we've got teachers here from all of secondary, so we kind of split the difference with English 1, and in our new standards 7D, analyze characteristics and structural elements of an informational text. Now, I could do a similar handout for teachers and students. The teachers would just be the blank column like you see here on the right. But as you get through it, knowing that that's my standard as a teacher, my copy is going to have those guiding questions. It's going to have my notes of where that standard really shines in the passage so that I can model my thinking or again, ask those prodding questions. So let's kind of look at what that looks like. So here, kind of on the second page, paragraph 5 reads, for her study, which notes that its data was originally presented at the Calgary Youth Science Fair, Keegan used a professional grade decibel meter to compile loudness measurements of electric hand dryers at dozens of public restrooms in Alberta, Canada, from 2015 to 2017. He purposefully selected locations that children might frequent, such as schools, parks, restaurants, and malls. And then you'll notice in the right-hand column, I've got my first kind of guiding question, my first piece I'm going to use with kids to make sure that they are spotting some things. So that question is, what is the author trying to suggest about Keegan's findings in paragraph 5? Okay, so we know we're looking at structural elements of and characteristics of informational text. So I really want to think, what is he trying to suggest? What's a point that's trying to be made here? I even have a exemplar response listed. My kids may not get to that specific answer, but I've already kind of scripted what I'm looking for. So if this is a think aloud, that's what I'm going to say. If it's a kind of student class discussion, this is where I'm trying to steer them. So the exemplar answer is, he's trying to establish that her findings should be taken seriously because she used professional grade decibel meter and she performed the experiment at multiple locations with different conditions and hand dryers. So we've got kind of that fleshed out, that idea that's trying to be communicated. It's also a good idea if you're scripting this out, have some sentence stems ready that you can kind of set up your kids that need that extra help. You've got that kind of structure, that scaffolding in place. The other question that's there, what can the reader conclude from paragraph 6? Again, just having them boil down what is the big idea from this portion of the text. Okay. And we see this kind of stretch throughout. Last one, why does the author provide multiple examples of decibel level evidence and findings? Okay, so if we're thinking about characteristics and structural elements of an informational text, a lot of times, guys, we're thinking what? Controlling idea. Okay.
Right. This supports the controlling idea.
And then this supports the controlling idea. So that's a really key component of the structure and elements of that kind of passage. So kind of steering the kids to that, helping them see these pieces. Now, I mean, this is like training wheels, right? I mean, we're not going to use this kind of guiding the entire year. This will be something that we start with and help build the habits in the kids, but by the end of the year, they should be able to think through this for themselves and really start developing that understanding and developing these questions without all the prompting and scaffolding.
And I think too that this kind of thing lends itself to, it doesn't just have to be like, all right, well, here's your space, annotate over here after I've modeled for it, or here's the question, you just write your annotation. Just the way you would normally do class. I want you to mix, pair, share with this. I want you to talk to a shoulder partner and then write down what you think is the best answer after you've discussed it with your classmates, so that we're also coaching students how to have conversations about what they read.
Right, and that's another important thing to consider is when you're building these questions and lining them up, where you're going to have them in the text and whatnot, is really planning out, how do I want the students to process this? Am I going to have them do think, pair, shares in small group, get up and find a partner, or whole class discussion? And by not only planning your questions, but planning the response or how you want the response to really take shape is also very important.
I think that's great. This is a great example of beginning with the end in mind, because while we're not quite there yet, as we get to the written response portion, the things that the students have marked and listed here are ideally should shape whatever that written response is that we're going to do following the reading and analysis. So it's really important that we've kind of already thought through that. What are we going to ask? What are we getting to? And have these questions drive to that point, so that when we do begin the written response, our kids have something to work from because they've already done the right kind of analysis. But before we get there, let's take some practice time to make those guiding questions. So in the next portion of this module, what you'll see is a link to this passage. And instead of working with 7D, we're going to shift gears and work with another standard. And I'm going to ask you to generate a couple of guiding questions for that standard that you could use to push along student understanding in the passage.